Leana is a great example of somebody who does train very hard and shows she's training very hard, as you can see from the fact that she's failing her reps. Training to failure is not a bad thing. Before I start the video and before I explain where I've been, I want to let you know that there is indeed something interesting happening today. Obviously, as you're aware, I run group coaching, which is where I basically put together training programs for you guys to follow as a group, which is all run through the Train Heroic app and website, cheaper than your Netflix subscription, and it's a pretty good time because you can either work out alone or communicate with the community to talk about things. You can also talk to me in the message board and on your workout so I can see what's going on, and you can just ask me loads of questions if you fancy it. It's special and it's relevant today because today is the start of a brand new block. So there's a brand new program launching today for both gym workouts, so those who have access to a gym, and also home workouts, so those who work out at home. If you want to get bored, now's the perfect time to do it. Although you can technically start whenever you see fit, figured that first day of the new program is probably the best day. So have a gander. It's obviously linked down below in the description. Or if you fancy signing up in the next few days, you can just run this week whenever you see fit and get back to it properly next week. Quickly, I feel like I should probably explain briefly where I've been. Basically, it's been a bit of a bad time, gonna be honest with you. A lot has happened over the last couple of weeks, far more than I could ever explain at the start of the video and far more than I'd actually like to explain at the start of the video. Due to myself and looking after myself at this stage, I don't think I'm ready to talk about it, and I don't think I'm going to be ready to talk about it for a long time, but when I am ready to talk about it, if I see fit, I will let you know. Just know that everything is probably going to be okay, and I think that we're coming out the other side of it. On to the actual main source of the video is Leana Deeb. So Leana Deeb, obviously we know Leana Deeb, I'm a big fan of her. I've expressed I'm a big fan of her many times. What better way to start off talking about working out again than with a lower body workout, which is apparently the ultimate lower body workout, but I'll be the judge of that. In typical fashion, I'm not going to listen to what she is saying. I'm going to form my own opinions and give my own criticism and input and appreciation based on what I'm seeing, not what I'm hearing. She's obviously starting off the lower body workout with some mobility, so hip openers and whatnot. So for the people who are running the Train Heroic group program, I typically do recommend and link them mobility routines to include as part of their workouts, just to make sure they're moving through relevant ranges of motion to the workout they're going to be conducting afterwards. Starting off with the Bulgarian split squat. Again, Leana is actually using a barbell for this. You can certainly do so. I typically find it easier to balance with dumbbells personally, but you can use a barbell if you want to. The box here looks a bit high to me. It looks like she's struggling with the range of motion, which again, like I said, does indicate the box might be a bit high. So for that, I'd probably recommend dropping down the box to anywhere from about 6 to 12 inches, depending on how you see fit. The other thing to note with the Bulgarian split squat is, I think it's a great movement. I also believe that it's the devil in exercise form and potentially has contributed to my disappearance for the last couple of weeks. Maybe that caused the episode and the decline. Who knows? Maybe it was purely due to split squats. Although yes, I do favour including them if they're relevant to your goals, what I do actually favour is including them later on in the session. Personally, my preference is I typically prefer including less stable movements later on, whereas I typically like to prioritise more stable movements earlier on where I can put more into them without having to worry about stability as a consideration or potentially even a limiting factor. Other things to know with obviously split squats, you can essentially make them a bit more quad bias or glute bias depending on what you want. Glute bias, I typically adopt more of like a forward lean, flat front foot, things like that. Quad bias, I typically adopt more of an upright torso and typically try and elevate that front heel as well, so I can essentially work on driving that front knee as far forward as possible, maximizing knee flexion and essentially lengthening the quads as much as you possibly can, which is a good time. Very quickly, quick intermission I've got to throw out there. Obviously I mentioned the new Train Heroic block, which has already started, obviously linked down below in the description, but there's also another thing. I'm taking on more online clients to work with me on a one-to-one basis, and Ryder, who you know from the videos, has also come on board as a TFNL coach as well now, and he is too going to be taking on online clients. So if you're interested in working with either of us, you will have the option to choose, and I will be involved in the process even if you choose Ryder. Then please have a look down below in the description and click the application form, fill it in, it'll get sent to me and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. In addition to that, obviously the growth guide, the home workout guide, and all those bits and bobs are always linked down below in the description as well. So if you fancy a workout guide with over 30 weeks of training within it for either either the gym or home, then have a gander down below at the description, see if any of those guides suit you. And also know that 2 more guides should be coming next month, which will be a bit more of an upper body focused guide and a glute focused guide as well, so you have an option to choose between either of those if you fancy it. So they are coming, and they will be add-ons to the growth guide that will be linked down below in the description. Obviously, as I mentioned, although you don't need the growth guide for them, it certainly helps as a growth guide includes a lot of relevant foundation information that you could apply to these guides. So an RDL is essentially a Romanian deadlift. You can essentially choose whether you want it to be more hamstring or glute dominant depending on how you do it. If your legs are a bit straighter and remain straighter throughout the movement, although range of motion will be limited, it typically places a bit more emphasis on the hamstrings. If your knees are a bit more bent and you push those hips further back, typically a bit more glute dominant, and the range of motion is typically going to be larger. The one thing I will say here is flat back is kind of not relevant, but not as big as you might think. As you're going through the movement, you're going to find it really hard to maintain that really flat back. Having a flat back is not be all and end all when it comes to deadlifting. Essentially what you look for is a consistent back, not necessarily flat back. So upper back rounding, for example, isn't a bad thing provided the angle of your upper back remains consistent throughout the whole movement. It becomes more of a bad thing if the back angle is changing. The grip. I just don't like doing mixed grip on things unless I really have to. So things like the RDL, things like the SLDL, I would typically favor using straps. If you mix grip, that can lead to some rotational imbalances occurring, which means you're essentially developing muscular imbalances, which means you're going to have to correct them to prevent injuries and whatnot from occurring. Not saying always, but potentially. So again, I would definitely favor straps if you can, because your grip is probably going to give out before your hamstrings or glutes do. So supersetting a single leg hip thrust, again, you can do if you want. The thing to note here though is because you are using a dumbbell, you're going to find it really hard to actually overload this effectively, because how heavy are the dumbbells? How heavy of a dumbbell can you lift from the floor to your hip? And also, how uncomfortable is that going to be? I would typically favor using a barbell, even if you are going to use a single leg glute bridge or hip thrust, unless obviously you're at home and you're a bit limited to equipment, then it's a bit different. And that superset, I see, it seems with a step up. The knee kick throughout from like a hypertrophy perspective does nothing. The step up though is a fair movement, provided the bench you're using is stable, isn't going to wobble all over the place. As you'll notice, Leana did a shortened position movement, being the hip thrust, into a lengthened position movement, being the step up. I back it. That's good. Muscles typically fatigue in the shortened position first. Therefore, it makes sense doing a shortened position movement followed by a lengthened position movement if you are going to superset. If you go lengthen first, you're going to find it really hard to get into that shortened range, thus making that movement potentially redundant or maybe ineffective. If you shorten position first, you're not going to struggle as much in that lengthened range. Therefore, both movements are going to be pretty effective. So that's actually a really good superset. I actually fully back that. You can also do glute bridges, superset with like squat variations, things like that. So again, shortened to lengthened. When you're training the same muscle at different muscle lengths, so shortened versus lengthened, I typically refer to that as a compound set rather than a superset. Okay, a finisher. What is occurring in this finisher? So firstly, that's a limitation of goblet squats, is actually getting the weight up here. If you're going to do a anterior loaded squat, so a squat in which the weight is in front of you, it's probably better you do a front squat, because again, you don't have to worry about getting the weight up. Heel elevation allows more knee flexion, which allows you to lengthen the quads further. Big yes. If you're going to do anything quad bias, you want to put yourself in a position where you can essentially drive the knees as far forward as possible. So I respect this. But the thing with the goblet squat is what's going to give out first? Your quads or your core, your arms, your shoulders, things like that. If you are going to include a goblet squat, again, I would only really do so for either technical purposes, or if you are limited for equipment, or if you are going to, I definitely throw them at the end of the session, as she has done here, when you are most fatigued. Therefore, the quads can't handle as much load. Therefore, the load becomes less of a limiting factor. So, in fairness to Leana, good placement here. Good placement. Again, not my favorite movement itself, but if I'm going to put it anywhere, putting it nearer the end is definitely a good time. And then she obviously treated that as a bit of a drop set by going straight into a lower weight, straight into body weight, which again is a bad time. A bad time in the sense that it's going to be very hard. A good time in the sense that you're probably going to, I don't know, is there a good time at all? Probably not. But as a whole, like the exercises selected were okay. I think it's key to know that from a hypertrophy perspective, things like the single leg dumbbell glute bridge, I probably wouldn't include. Things like the goblet squat, I probably wouldn't include. But from the perspective of maybe a bit of like all-round fitness, which is essentially what Leana does, that's obviously giving my opinion based on what I do, but based on what I know Leana does and how she trains, where it's not purely hypertrophy focused, I do think the inclusion of like those movements, like the goblet squat and whatnot, probably have more of a time and a place, because she's not doing it purely to maximize the amount of muscle she's able to build. She's doing it to align very much with her goals, which are all-round fitness. So doing anterior loaded movements are going to bring in a lot more of of the core might be relevant to her. Doing some unilateral glute bridges, again, that might work on imbalances and whatnot due to the unilateral aspect of things, might be more relevant to her. I'm a fan of Leana. I think she does really good stuff. I think one of the things she really preaches in her videos and one thing she does promote is training intensity. So regardless of what you're trying to do, I think ultimately training intensity is going to be key, especially if you're looking at actually really trying to push building muscle and trying to build as much muscle as you can build, which again is very much individual. You do want to make sure you're training hard enough, and most people probably aren't. Leana is a great example of somebody who does train very hard and shows she's training very hard, as you can see from the fact that she's failing her reps. Training to failure is not a bad thing. I train to failure. I'm trying to build as much muscle as I can build. In doing so, I need to train to failure and sometimes even do partial reps, depending on whether stretch mediated hypertrophy is something that muscle may benefit from. So by that I mean, let's say you do a goblet squat, you can't fail anymore, doing those half reps, going as high as you can, but really staying in that lengthened position, so the bottom position, until you're fried. I think that's a good time. But as a whole, honestly, I respect it. Again, things I would change from my goals, but again, this video is not purely based on my goals. This video is based on the consideration of multiple different people's goals. No comment question of the week this week, and probably not for the next video either, because obviously I've been a bit MIA, although I do encourage you to leave a question down below in the comment section for me to answer when I get to videos for next week. Thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for tolerating my absence. Just know that in 2 years, I've not missed a single upload on this channel, and it saddens me that I had to do so. Just know that doing so was unfortunately necessary, but I am back, and thank you for tolerating the video.